thank you to our guests, our esteemed guests. We've got a lot of experience here in various areas within sports, on the high school level and the college level. So looking forward to kind of diving deep into what compliance is, what role it plays, kind of in college sports and in sports in general. And so to kind of start out, I just looked up a definition of compliance in Webster. And what I read here is the act or process of complying to a desire, a demand, proposal, or regimen. And so as I think about that, and we think about the work that we do, there's a lot more that goes into it, correct? It's not just as simple as that. And so to kind of lead into our conversation, whoever would like to share, you could maybe speak on what does compliance mean to you within the realm of our work?
I'd be happy to start. For me, at the high school level, I work for the Ohio High School Athletic Association. We're a voluntary group of 800 plus member schools, and just trying to equitably carry out the rules that our member schools have voted into place. I think at the high school level, there's a lot of misconception that the OHSAA develops the rules and then the schools have to follow it, whereas they are member schools voted upon rules, and for us to try and carry out their desires and making sure everyone's playing by the same playing rules. That's what I think compliance is.
I suppose I'll jump in here. I think similar. I mean, I think we hear about this at the NCAA level all the time, insofar as that it's a member-driven organization and all these sorts of things. But I think, from my perspective, compliance is about sort of lending a modicum of predictability to the rules. I think I tell our staff this all the time, but there are a limited number of words in the rule book and an infinite number of situations that can arise at any given time. And our job is to sort of match rule to situation, apply a rule to situation. I think fundamentally what that means is when something occurs that hasn't happened or something similar has happened in the past, it's about making sure that our constituents, the people we work with, whether it's student athletes, whether it's coaches, whether it's boosters, whether it's administrators, have again that sort of predictability in terms of what happened yesterday is going to be the same thing that happens today, is going to be the same thing that sort of happens tomorrow.
And so with that, I think you may have alluded to, but the interpretive philosophy that exists. Kevin, do you mind speaking to maybe how that applies to, how we enforce rules, or how rules are enforced?
Yeah, I think it's the interpretive philosophy. Ultimately, what that ultimately allows is some discretion, an educated discretion on a particular situation. So this was something that, at least from an NCAA perspective, what they started to allow around 2013, if I remember correctly. And it allows us, they give us some examples of what would constitute as interpretation philosophy. But then in addition to that, still knowing when to actually apply those, and when can you comfortably defend something that it may be a slight adjustment with the rules, but ultimately you can protect it in the sense where it's not going to cause major damage. Because at the end of the day, anytime you're looking at anything from a rules perspective, you're looking about what you're protecting. In our particular situation, we're looking to protect the institution, through the one arm of athletics. So every decision that we ultimately make, we have to bear that in mind. Are we putting the institution at risk? And that becomes a major source of reflection when applying any type of interpretive philosophy.
Marscilla, as an AD, athletic director in Dayton schools, correct? How does Kristin's work overlap what you do on a day-to-day?
God, it's so hard. No, we work very, very closely with Ohio High School. We have so many situations that happen, and I think for us is trying to be as consistent as possible. We work a lot with the charter schools in our district, and that can become challenging because they're not necessarily members of Ohio High School. So they don't understand all the rules and regulations and what we have to abide by as we member schools and playing in our schools. So that's kind of one of the things that is really, really can be difficult for us. But again, consistency is consistency is key, and we try to do that with every student athlete that comes to our office, and making sure that they're doing things correctly and that their parents or guardians have that information as well. I think a lot of times some of the rules get misinterpreted because there are so many situations and they vary. So I think that's probably one of the most difficult things we deal with.
You talk about there's so many rules, and your manual is a lot different than the NCAA manual, which is about 450 pages, and then we have an online database as well with further information. Matt, how do you know? How do you remember what you need to know? How do you remember each specific bylaw and how to apply it? I know you have a large brain and you're very smart. Outside of that,
That's far overstating my ability. I think, just like anything, when the sort of database of information is so vast, a lot of what you remember is sort of situational in nature, right? So I don't have all 450 pages of the manual memorized. I can't give you the date and content of every interpretation or every educational column or every violation. Anyone who says they can do that is lying. But what you do remember is concepts, right? Like Kevan was sort of alluding to earlier. What is the goal of a particular rule or set of rules? And if you understand that, if you understand sort of the governance process and how how a bill becomes a law, right? It's just like Schoolhouse Rock. If you understand some of that, it helps inform sort of what you should be aware of, what you should be thinking about, and where you should look when something arises that you're not sure of the answer. So I think that sort of fundamentally helps. If you sort of track on that process from the beginning, it really does inform sort of how you go about your day-to-day.
And I would add to that just the institutional knowledge that you develop over the course of your career, and you remember that situation, your coworkers can, and just as long as you're continuing to make those consistent interpretations of each situation so as not to appear arbitrary in front of a judge, those situations in the back of your mind definitely help.
And one other thing too, what I was going to mention was we're trying to be conscientious of not only NCAA rules, but also our institutional rules that we may have established, as well as in our particular situation at Ohio State, any Big Ten rules that are specific to a situation. So we have to be very conscientious of a number of really different governing bodies associated with any situation that may arise. So I think a lot of the focus gets honed in on the NCAA, and that's a big piece of it, but there are a number of different pieces that are associated with it as well.
and so while it's so much information, so many rules, so much what we may call red tape, Kristin, as far as from Ohio high school stands, how do we educate? How are you teaching the external people, the students, the parents, the families? What efforts is Ohio high school taking to do that?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's one that we're continuing to evolve. Our primary communication is to our school athletic administrators and our principals, and then we are hopeful that they are continuing to distribute that information out to other constituents, such as the parents and the athletes. But that is challenging because of the turnover, especially in the athletic director world. It's rare to find a veteran AD at 20 or so years. So continuing to direct our primary communication to our member schools, but also I know our current executive director, Jerry Snodgrass, is very committed to town hall meetings such as this, where parents might be able to ask some questions. Really just put a face on the OHSA instead of just a rule book.
Marcella, on the district level?
OHSA provides a lot of information on the website.
Too much sometimes.
So,
You can say.
but it's extremely helpful. They even provide the preseason parent meeting with information for us. We don't have to really do much if we don't want to when it comes to that. But we're also having like a town hall. We're having coffee with athletics, just to get more parents involved and can kind of see what's going on in the department and how rules are applied, what you have to look for, because a lot of it's always reactive. You hate to have a kid come in where they want to play sports, but they're not passing 5 classes, and you hate to give that information. But if we could have gotten them sooner and parents were more involved, we wouldn't have to have them sit out. So they're extremely helpful. We're very pro OHSA and big public schools.
Right thing to say, politically correct. Matt, and maybe you can talk about the campus side of things and how our education efforts are maybe ramped up and with our large office and the growth in our office, what measures do we take on an institutional level?
Sure. So I think fundamentally, you know, regardless of how large your compliance office is, regardless of how large your institution is, where the sort of rubber meets the road is the fact that our resources in the compliance office are finite and our constituents are almost infinite. And so it's about being targeted, catching constituents early, and ensuring that the right education is matched up with the right constituent is basically what it boils down to, right? So on the high school side, it's about catching student athletes early, making sure, like I take the show on the road, you know, it's a dozen high schools a year, it feels like, to make sure that people in their town, their community are educated about initial eligibility rules, for example. But if Jamie's doing education with a booster group or some external constituent, what I'm telling the Dayton Public Schools isn't going to be relevant to, the barber on High Street that Jamie's educating about extra benefits. So making sure that it's targeted, making sure that it's consistent across, similar types of constituents, and it's also about making sure that there's a plan in place to make it, understandable and repeatable, right? I think if I walked into the, school of, communication, because I have some education for them as it relates to their interaction with student athletes, and I walk in with a 450-page rule book that's Byzantine and hard to understand, the message is going to get lost. It's about being particular about what I need them to know and making sure that they understand that in a clear and concise way.
Do you have anything to add?
Yeah, and then on top of it, it's trying to figure out a way to be engaging with the material, because it's frankly, it's pretty dry stuff. So that's one of the challenges I think that we're constantly trying to brainstorm on how to get it across, whether it be student groups, alumni associations, the various departments, even within athletics. It's one of the challenges, and especially even with the kind of the modern day student athlete. I mean, I would say like 10 years ago, you had no problem doing like an hour-long ed session. Nowadays, you wouldn't even consider doing that, because there's no sense in doing it for that extended period of time in one sitting. So we're thinking about how to do quick hitters in 20 minutes and really drive certain points home. We're constantly challenged with with brainstorming certainly different ways to educate and be engaging with the material.
We all have former student athletes in common. Each one of us up here played in a collegiate sport, ran, played basketball. How has your perspective changed in the inner workings of sport? You in the district level, in the high school space, you as well, but us now on the college level, what do you know now that you had no clue back then?
Well, for me, it was more so, I went to one high school. I went to Pickerington, and I didn't think about transferring or anything like that. So I guess I'm surprised at how often student athletes transfer and for what reasons. And it's so common nowadays. And I think if parents realize what some of the consequences of that and what that can lead to, there wouldn't be as much of that. But that's not something that I expected. I stay at one high school, I stayed home, went to college here. So that's very surprising to me. And even so, still now, when people do it, I'm like, they're going to sit half the season. Is that really worth it? Because you don't get along with the coach. So it's surprising, but it happens a lot.
For me as an athlete, I was just oblivious to the background work that goes into making sure all the athletes are eligible for every event. We run our state tournaments, and the background work that has to go into, we have to get your rosters, we have to get your pass list, we have to get your bus driver name, and that athletic administrator in that seat has to be responsible for all that information, whereas you as the athlete just have to show up and play the game. So it's amazing the amount of work that our athletic administrators have to do at the high school level, but then also at our state office level, just the administration that goes behind that.
Yeah, I think to that point, to that point, kind of felt the same way. I mean, my student athlete experience was a little different. I went to a small school in New Hampshire with less than 1,000 students. So it wasn't like I was at an Ohio State or anything like that. But, still obviously the same eligibility rule, or not the same, but some eligibility rules apply at a Division III school. But for me, what's been eye-opening, and certainly the different institutions that I've worked at, is just the resources that everyone has available to them, especially at a place like Ohio State. You applaud the students that ultimately decide to take advantage of all those resources. And it's kind of fascinating. In reality, like, all of our student athletes should be using all of our resources that we have available, because this is really, it's a 4 or 5 year time frame where this is no longer going to exist ever again. So, it's really about encouraging those student athletes to use those resources, because certainly for my student athlete experience, it's kind of the same way. I was more focused on just getting my grades and playing baseball, and outside of that, I didn't really care about anything else that was really surrounding me and that I could have used to my benefit, certainly in the long term. So I think as in a paying it forward type mentality, really want to make sure that our student athletes, and at least getting that message out to our student athletes, to certainly use your resources that you have available here.
Similar to what everyone else was saying, but I think the one thing that sort of struck me as I've sort of evolved in the profession is, and this is going to sound strange, I think, but I have more of a respect for the bureaucracy. Bureaucracy obviously has a really negative connotation, right? And to a certain extent, I understand it. And I think you're going to hear a lot on the second panel about how it's messy and imperfect, and in a lot of ways flawed. But as a student athlete, and as you can tell by my linebacker-esque physique, I was a cross-country runner. What I saw then was, paperwork that I thought was sort of mindless scribble, right? And now, when you see the sort of the work and the sweat and the really sort of personal touch that goes into a lot of that bureaucracy, you have more of a respect for the people that are carrying it out. And again, it's not perfect, and it's flawed in a lot of ways, and a lot of what we do is rightly so challengeable. But it gives you more of a respect for the people behind the bureaucracy in a lot of ways.
Or did you want to open it up for a question?
Yeah, we'd love to hear from you, what your questions are, what thoughts you have. You can't have come here all this way and not had any questions about compliance. I'll start then. You kind of opened the door for this, Matt, that it sometimes feels messy, and if we're going to see a headline, I went through and actually spent the last day doing a variety of Google searches related to NCAA compliance, student athlete compliance, and I would say at least 70% of them are negative stories. In fact, I found one guy who explained what it was like to be a compliance officer in a very helpful Q&A, but most of them had to do with the problems that come with compliance. Why do you think this is such an intersection of challenge and requirement and necessity, and how do we kind of confront those challenges?
I think there are a few factors at play, right? One, this is sort of, especially on the NCAA side, it's a very public thing, right? Especially at this level. Working at Ohio State is a very public job in a lot of ways. Now, hopefully our jobs specifically are not public, because if you see my name in a newspaper, it's probably because I got fired. But I think the highly public nature, the fact that everyone who follows sports to a certain extent has at least some knowledge about the process, maybe not quite as much as they think they do. And frankly, I don't know everything, and neither is Kevan or Jamie about what's going on in the world. Same thing, I would guess you would say, as it relates to the OHSA sort of sphere. But that fact, combined with the fact that there are some legitimate criticisms to be levied at what we do. Now, what I would say is that, in our sort of modern day death to the NCAA mantra that I think permeates a lot of what we hear, I think oftentimes what people sort of forget is that some sort of governing organization would appear that would likely be similarly imperfect, similarly flawed, similarly messy, similarly slow to modernize, Now, that's not to say it can't be improved upon, but I think sometimes in our zest for improvement, we skew a little bit towards anarchy, or a preference towards anarchy, which I think is dangerous in a lot of ways. Sorry.
So, what would be for you three, and maybe even for Marscilla also, but what would be the one thing you would change? If you could king for a day, queen for a day, what would you change?
Fair question. I've long said I should be king.
I mean,
So you're thinking a single rule, a single concept?
Really, it's up to you. Up to you.
Okay, does that be single or can we go
Yeah.
I think we'll talk about this, and I go back and forth now as a practitioner about the name and image likeness piece. As a former student athlete at Ohio State, playing the #1 sport at this school from a notoriety standpoint.
I didn't know you were a wrestler.
There it is, which is now a revenue generating sport here, which is unique. From my experience, knowing how my career ended, my two years as a letterman, and then transitioning on my last 2 years into an injured student athlete, medical non-counter, that whole process, my window of profiting stayed here at Ohio State. And so my guys going off to the league, going on to play and make millions of dollars, which we all come to Ohio State thinking we're going to do as a football student athlete, I didn't get that opportunity. So from that perspective, I struggle, and I see where we do need to make some changes. But on the other end, as a practitioner, and now talking to booster groups and seeing what all is out there and what other schools may be doing and issues with the FBI case and things of that sort, I see how do we regulate that? How do we protect college sports, continue to give these student athletes these opportunities that they probably otherwise wouldn't have from an education standpoint, but also allow them to profit, allow them to make money off the name, image, and likeness. I struggle with that tension. I think I want there to be there will be a time, not I want, it's not my opinion. There will be a time where they profit off their name, image, likeness. How that looks and how that's regulated is still up in the air.
Mine's not going to be as exciting as that one from Jamie, but I work in the financial aid space, and I think when scholarships went to start including cost of attendance, I think that was the first step in getting to a much better place certainly from a scholarship perspective and amount of money or amount of scholarship dollars that a student athlete can receive. I still think we're as an organization tend to be a little bit restrictive in some of those areas. And we're making steps in progress, I believe, at least on every couple of years through our legislative process, but that's certainly in my own opinion, one particular area that I'd like to see change or improve as time goes forward.
And Kevan, I'm sure you can go into the whole need-based piece. You can maybe explain that to the group, how we have to count, and sometimes we have to, they're forced to exempt their need-based aid, or those that have need.
Yeah, this is a very specific topic, but right now NCAA has rules associated with institutional need-based scholarships. So effectively, if a student athlete is on an athletic scholarship and they qualify for an institutional need-based scholarship, even something as little as like $1,000 that's based on their demonstrated need through filing a FAFSA and completing the FAFSA process. That $1,000 that in this hypothetical scenario, if they were to receive that, would count against NCAA scholarship limits. So it can be very restrictive if a team doesn't have the room to take on that additional equivalency or that additional aid that would count against their limits. So certainly that's one particular area that they've tried to address through the legislative process. And we're still trying to continue to get to a place where I think certainly as a membership, speaking about every NCAA member institution, where we can find a way to put student athletes in the best position to get aid that they certainly qualify for and need.
And this is more probably conceptual than rules driven. And I think we're doing a little bit better of a job as a membership now. But a lot of the legislative process over the history of the NCAA has been designed to sort of, I'll call it incentivize equity, right? And make sure that, Ohio State is on a level playing field, not just with, Alabama and Michigan and Texas, but also with Iowa State and schools in the MAC and smaller schools in that. And I think we've seen a shift in, I would say, the last probably 3 to 5 years, where there's been a little bit more, I think, sort of nodding to the reality that you're never going to be able to legislate that, and trying to think about more of what we do as designed to maximize the student athlete experience, right? And the more we can do to in any way, shape, or form, some of the ways Jamie was talking about, some of the ways that Kevan was talking about, the more we can do in that space and sort of get away from the idea that we're necessarily going to be able to legislate equity into the system, I think, A, the better off we're going to be on an individual student basis, but B, when you think about sort of rulemaking, the legislative process in that space, you are less likely to run into some of the inherent contradictions that are very, very apparent in sort of today's NCAA.
Just going back to if I could change one thing, and again, I'm only speaking for where I'm currently employed, but I wish that our divisions were based on school enrollment. Again, right now we're in competitive balance, and it can vary from year to year what divisions our teams are in. So I would be in favor of going back to that structure.
Yeah, I'm kind of the outlier, I guess, on the group in terms of being at the governing body right now and being able to more directly impact those changes. But for me, a frustration that we get is there is a lot of legislative intervention that comes from our General Assembly, which really impacts the jobs that I do on a daily basis. It used to be that if you played sports at school, that's where you walked the halls. And that's not the case anymore. There's a lot of students from charter schools, home educated schools, kids who attend non-public schools that don't offer a sport, that not through the vote of our membership, but through the desire of our General Assembly to allow those students a participation opportunity. So sometimes we don't even like the rules that are in place, but have to deal with those things on a daily basis.
Other questions?
Since Jamie opened up the elephant in the room, at the high school level, how much are you looking at California and other states that have legislation in the works in the name, image, and likeness, and how does that impact your day-to-day work?
For me, it's terrifying to think of high school students looking at that right now. They should be focused obviously on their grades, and my fear is they're going to be so concerned with a social media persona and what's going to get me more endorsements and get me more money if I do make it to play in college. And I think they'll start to lose their focus on really staying focused on their education. So I think being able to educate them, if this ever does happen for them, this would be most important. But that's my biggest fear, because then we're not even really focusing on, again, the education and what they can get by going to college for free. Now it's about money and likes and shares, and right now I don't think that's particularly good for our student athletes.
For us, with the recent Alabama case of the real high-profile USA student athlete, it really opened our eyes to, it does impact such a small percentage of our student athletes. We have between 350 and 400,000 participating, and the percentage of athletes who are worried about their amateurism and in terms of their likeness is very minimal, but we do still have to address it. And it's a continuing dialogue of how much do we want to permit, but because that is such a small portion of what we do, I think our regulations in that area, going back to that institutional knowledge, I think we as a staff can do a better job educating people of this is what would constitute a violation and very clearly spell those things out to try and help those student athletes. So I will admit that that's something that I think we continue to improve upon.
Other questions? Yes.
One thing that you talked about earlier was the bureaucracy of just compliance itself. This might be a little bit broader than you know off the top of your head or anything, but
I'm willing to make it up.
okay. That's how I teach.
Sorry.
But anyways, I'd be kind of interested in knowing, like just in terms of numbers of people that are employed just for compliance purposes at the university and like the overall size of that bureaucracy itself within Ohio State.
Sure. So I do know this. So we have the largest compliance office in the country. And a lot of that has to do, I think, two reasons. Someone made reference a bit in the audience to sort of the reactionary nature of what we do, and I think reactionary gets a certain negative connotation, right? Like bureaucracy and reactionary. If you're a bureaucratic reactionary, like no one's paying you a compliment, right? But a lot of the size of our staff has to do with the major infraction that occurred here back in 2010, 2011, and a lot of the staff was hired because of some flaws and holes we saw in our compliance program. So we have between 14 and 15 people in our athletic compliance office. We also have the university compliance office that oversees medical compliance and import-export and lab safety and things like that. So I would say the entire compliance apparatus at the university level was probably 70 people, 60, 70 people, something like that. So it is large, and it's certainly, I think if sometimes a lot of coaches, they wish they could snap a finger and make half of us disappear, fall through a trap door or something like that. But I think everyone plays a role. I think externally you see 15 compliance people that all must be doing the same thing, but we all play sort of a very specific role. Like Kevan has forgotten more about financial aid than I know. Jamie knows a lot about education, making sure that our constituents are educated. I'm more of an eligibility and academics guy. So it's all compliance, but we're all sort of playing different roles.
So in terms of compliance, what's the most difficult part from the transition to high school to college athletics? Like in terms of, in high school they can't just commit and go, they have to, go through talking to different coaches, when that period opens, when it ends, taking scholarship money, just that entire process. What's the hardest part of that transition?
From a personal level, you mean, or from our current position and that one?
Either or, what, just personally, you can do personally and then as a broader scheme.
Well, I'll start. For me personally, I never thought about that when I was in high school. We had our counselors and they took care of everything. You were registered for the correct classes, never really a concern with that. But from where I'm at now, I understand that's not a resource that every school district has, where you have to make sure that these kids are in a certain amount of classes. So what we've tried to do with Dayton, we use a program called Core Course GPA, where it's free. We purchased it for our student athletes and our parents, but it allows them to kind of play around with their grades and what they have to do to qualify to receive a scholarship. And we have so many kids in so many schools, it's not possible for us to reach every single one of them. So we kind of hoping that this program can help with that, because the last thing we want to have is a student athlete who can receive a scholarship or has the ability to, but then they don't meet the requirements. So that's one thing that we've tried to do, because again, like we don't have that with the resources we had in Pickering.
I think I have younger siblings that are student athletes currently. One of the things I think, and I can reflect back to when I was a student athlete, I just didn't know what I didn't know. Didn't know the rules. I didn't know what I was walking into as far as compliance until I stepped foot on campus. Back then it was called the clearinghouse when I was a student athlete, and which is now called the eligibility center. But we were fortunate to have counselors at Pickering Central. For me, it was Central. You were a few years back. It was one. We both were Tigers. But I just didn't know. And so walking into now this restrictive, what we saw it as is a restrictive environment or more restrictive. It was a change to now have to ask questions, to have to rely on other people to provide me information when, when you're in high school, you're just going out playing and going to class and doing what you need to do from a day-to-day in high school. Now there's a bit more responsibility when you step into that college campus.
I was wondering, since you mentioned that back in 2010 that resulted in so many more staff being hired, would you say then that compliance is more to protect the university than the student?
Unequivocally. And it's sometimes hard for people to understand and even me to come to grips with sometimes, because we're people, right? We have and invest in relationships, but our job at the end of the day is to think of the institution absent its people. And it seems like it's kind of like a nebulous non-entity, right? But that has to be our job. And I think everyone who works in compliance struggles with that to a certain extent, because there are situations where we have to enforce rules or make a call that is sort of A, antithetical to what we would personally want to do, or B, inflict some measure of harm, perceived or otherwise, on very real people that we have very real relationships with, and that's not easy. And I think it's easy to think about yourself as you're just sort of the messenger and all these sorts of things, but that doesn't make that process any easier. And I'm not sure that I think a lot of the sort of semi-consensus that's emerged around compliance, especially as it relates to similar rules over the years, a lot of it is predicated on the idea that, well, I should decide. I'm me as a person. I'm the smartest person in the room, and I have great ideas. So why aren't all of my ideas being adhered to? And that's both something I believe and struggle with daily. Like I think I'm great, right? The only person who thinks I'm greater than I do is my mother. But sometimes you have to divorce yourself a little bit from that belief and just think about it as you're serving this particular role at this particular time, it's undoubtedly a challenge, and it's not something that gets very much easier as you sort of grow into the profession. So that's sort of a long answer to your question, but
That's by far the hardest part for me personally is you have a kid who you want to say yes to, but the rules don't allow you to as they're currently written, so it's very challenging.
Can you talk a little bit about the extent to which deviance occurs and how much time you allocate towards deviance? It seems like a lot of compliance, right, is educating and preventing problems. How much deviance occurs? Can you talk about it in terms of numbers and situations where you need to defend or punish specific behaviors, as well as your overall time commitments?
Yeah, I mean that's an interesting question. I think, and I've been at 5 different schools, I think, at this point. So I've kind of seen. I've been at small, big schools. I feel like, as in terms of coaches, I've seen it all. Like coaches who, like to push the line a little bit, and then coaches that are scared to ever break a rule. I think you kind of have to know, certainly from a compliance perspective, you have to know your audience to a certain extent, and know when to educate, when to really hammer like certain rules home through an educational process. With violations, ensure that you're reporting violations accordingly and to the NCAA to make sure that there's accountability on the back end. The biggest thing that we struggle with too is compliance. I think certainly from a coach's perspective, not speaking for all coaches, but certainly from some coaches' perspective, like where compliance serves as like the police, the issue. And that's not really what the intention is. The intention is trying to help guide everyone through these impossible rules. You know, the impossible rule book that's 450 pages. So a lot of it, especially what we have the benefit of doing with 15 compliance people at Ohio State, is we get to build those relationships with our coaches and with our student athletes. Because it's not like at a smaller school where it's one person for 700 people, we're 15 for 1,000. We can provide a little bit more individualized attention. And I think that's what goes a long way. Yeah, certainly is deviance an element of it? Absolutely. Again, you're always going to run into coaches that want to push the line, but it really becomes our responsibility when we encounter a coach that's of that, that kind of approaches it that way, that we make sure we're providing the proper attention and building that relationship to get the buy-in. That's the key thing from our perspective, is getting buy-in from all sources that we encounter.
So the upshot, though, of having a large office, and I was talking about this with a colleague the other day, that there's sort of a tipping point, right? Because we have so many more people and so many more eyes and so many more relationships, you also tend to discover more violations. We reported, I mean, this is public information, so I don't think I'm telling you any secrets, but we report probably 40 or so violations a year, something like that. And I don't believe for 1 second that's even half, even a quarter of the actual violations that occurred. But there is sort of a tipping point in terms of the more people you have, it's not just the minor violations, so we can talk about sort of what that entails, but also you wind up in the space of doing more, and I'll call them sort of internal investigations. You get a piece of information that you then have to investigate, and you otherwise might not have received that information if there were 4 compliance people around and not 15. And I think, so somewhat paradoxically, having more people creates more work, and a lot of that, we've referenced bureaucracy a number of times, and a lot of it sort of spins into the washing machine that is bureaucracy. So.
And I'll speak directly to what you guys are saying. So we probably have anywhere between 130 and 160 violations or infractions that are reported to our office each year. But that, in my mind, probably represents such a small percentage of the infractions that are actually occurring, because there's different groups of people. So there's those who are smart enough to know the rules, know when a violation is committed and report it, and then those who are not aware of the rules are committing those same violations and are not reporting them. And of those, say 150 violations that are reported each year, I would say 95% of them are accidents. There are very few of our member schools who are trying to cheat the system and are caught doing so. So that's encouraging, but obviously we can always continue to do a better job to educate people and make sure that they are aware of those rules.
I would say we deal the most with obviously self-reporting and use of an ineligible student athlete. If a student athlete gets ejected from a game, that's a pretty simple process. And then you have the weird situations where an official gets headbutted, which is not something you want to deal with, but it happens. And I think that OHSA makes it very easy for our ADs to report certain things like that. One thing we struggle with is just the culture that we're in right now, where some people may try to get away with things and try to use it against other schools. I can't tell you how many random pieces of information you get. Oh, I know this kid's ineligible. Well, why haven't you said something to someone? And they're trying to hold on to that until the playoffs, and then they want to spring it on a school. So, we definitely have challenges with integrity, but we try the best that we can and self-report. But I think that we've done a really great job in working with different schools and obviously Ohio High School and trying to change the culture that we're dealing with right now.
Okay, so with so much bureaucracy and negative perceptions and public scrutiny and contentiousness, I'm curious what made you want to get into compliance, or at least get into your current roles where you have to deal with compliance.
Well, I've long dreamed of following you into the academic sector. No, it's interesting. I actually got into this sort of completely by accident. I'm a reformed lawyer by trade, so I was interested in being. I think one of the things that Jamie pointed out, right, is that we're all former student athletes, and there's a certain extent of wanting to see the other side of it. And did I necessarily seek out when I was in law school to be a compliance officer at Ohio State? No, but I think the opportunity presented itself, and you learn more, and I think you get a greater respect and a greater understanding of what the position entails, and then it's 10 years later. I wish I had some sort of grand plan that made me think that this is the thing that is going to carry me through the next 40 years of my career, but it's not true. And I think although like you said, Brandon, I think when people hear compliance and compliance officer, there's a sort of negative connotation to it. I think once you're in, you see its warts, but I think you also have a greater respect for what not just the compliance office, but the athletic department as a whole is trying to accomplish holistically, and I think you want to remain a part of that for those of us that do.
I'd second that. For me, I'm in a group chat with a couple of my former teammates, and they call me Doug Archie Jr., which is like he's our boss. They call me the Feds because that was the perspective that they had. They didn't see the other side of it, and so as the conversations around this new bill are being had, I'm trying to enlighten them and help them understand, well, what about the regulation? What about this? And they're not hearing it, but I understand that it's a limited perspective. They don't see this side. They don't understand. And I try to explain it to them. It's better in person. But for me, it was an opportunity to serve student athletes, to give back to the institution that did so much for me. And it just happened to be in compliance. And so for me, I still consider myself somewhat of an amateur with 3 years of experience. But I've learned so much. Compliance has a unique, we touch every area within the department. Honestly, within campus-wide, we have touch points with every area. And I think in other positions, you don't get that opportunity. And so for me, I have a broader perspective of what maybe a coach might see here. I'm seeing this. So I appreciate that.
Yeah, and I would say just from my perspective, like many people kind of fell into it because my professor in grad school was the associate AD for compliance. But certainly what's kept me in it is just the student athletes. You win some crazy waiver that you thought had no chance and got a kid eligible. There's no better feeling. I certainly from this profession. And so those times you get it like once every year and a half, like it feels pretty good, and it's what keeps you going for that next one. So that's certainly either few and far between, but still it's what keeps me in it at least.
We're the only ones that celebrate that amongst each other.
Exactly.
We pat ourselves in the back. So coaches don't. Well, sometimes they do, but.
I think for me, it's just that we get to support student athletes and their families. I never thought I would be in the position that I'm in right now, and I just think back to there were people who were doing this for me, and I had no clue about it. And I want to be able to help as many student athletes be able to play as many sports as possible. And that is the one thing that keeps me going. I mean, literally the best part about getting out of the office is going to the games and seeing the kids play, or seeing that parent who, student athlete transferred, you were able to get them approved where they could play right away. That is probably the one thing that keeps me going.
For me, a complete accident as well, but my reward is a little different because I'm not dealing directly with those student athletes. For me, you really have to do this job effectively, in my opinion, to have that servant heart, to be able to serve others, and be able to communicate with them. And because I'd be communicating with Marscilla, this is the way you need to try and do this. And just to feel like you're helping them try and get through that process is what keeps me in it. I feel like I'm helping people.
Yeah, so just recently, quarterback Justin Fields at Ohio State was asked about what life was like on campus and if he's gotten to have that chance to walk across the oval and what he was really talking about campus. He replied that he hasn't really had that chance to be on campus. And I'm wondering, is that a good thing or a bad thing? And like, is there a common ground to where a student athlete can still feel like a student by attending in classes? And is is that something to be worried about where people are feeling like they're not so much students because they feel like somebody's doing the quizzes for them or helping them with the majority of their homework and things like that?
So two things there. It's two separate things. I want to address them separately. One, I think, and I read Justin's comments that were widely reported in the media just like you did, and I think so there's sort of two separate issues within that first issue, right? One, the proliferation of online classes increasingly distances students from each other. There's no doubt about that. We are very, very mindful, as Dr. Turner here can attest, about whether our student athlete population is enrolling solely in classes that keep them away from the general student body, only online, so they're spending more time with their team, more time with their facility, while also understanding that individual decisions need to be made for individual student athletes based on a number of factors. Overall, I would say more integration into the student body is unequivocally better. I mean, the reason that most of us are either in college or graduating college, and a lot of the experiential things that we remember from college are getting outside of our comfort zone. And any way we can encourage our student athletes to do that is for the better. You made an allusion to sort of academic misconduct in the second part of your sentence. I think one of the unfortunate consequences of a lot of the narrative that has grown up around college athletics is about the sort of rampant nature of that sort of academic misconduct. And I think that's one area where I really struggle insofar as that there are a lot of good people, I can speak to Ohio State specifically, right? There are a lot of good people at Ohio State that really and truly deeply care about whether these young men and women are receiving an education sort of commensurate with the rest of the student body, and an education that's going to set them up for the next 40, 50, 60 years of their life, regardless of whether they professionalize. And I think, does it happen? Undoubtedly. But I think we've sort of turned anecdote into rule in that space, and I think that's a dangerous narrative, because I think from a practitioner perspective, that's not something that, in my view, is occurring in the same way that people might perceive. Again, because there are safeguards in place, but also because there are people who truly care about these young men and women and making sure that their educational experience is, from a sort of a personal perspective, as positive as possible.
We have time for one last question. Anyone want to take our last question? Well, then I will. So, this is a great start at getting people to kind of understand what goes on behind the scenes, and we've all been kind of exposed to exactly what we talked about, the stereotyping of what our student athletes are like, this generalization of student athletes, like they're all the same and they all have the same experience. But the fact is there have to be rules in order for the system to work. So how do we balance that? How do we balance the humanity of people who have needs that aren't always the same? You have socioeconomic differences, you have environmental differences, there's lots of things that will change for people at different levels. But recognizing the need for law and the need for humans to have some type of interpretation that at least serves their needs, how do we reconcile that?
Tough question.
I would say going to the source, go directly to them. We spoke about a lot of various situations that happen and how to apply different rules, but go to the person that has the correct answer, not someone that thinks they know what's going on or this happened here at this school. And I think that would prevent a lot of things from happening. So we were kind of talking about it earlier. I think, thank God you guys don't accept calls from parents, because that would be a nightmare. But I wish that would happen more often, and then we wouldn't run into the issues that we do have.
Yeah, and I think to that point, exhausting all options, right? I mean, it's very easy to read a rule and treat it as a yes or no thing. But in reality, that's not always the case. Like I mentioned previously, like I'm going for, applying for a waiver through the NCAA or through the Big Ten Conference. Sometimes there are ways to get there. It's just going to take a little bit more work. So I think that certainly shows the value of a compliance professional when they're willing to exhaust all those options and put in the necessary work. But that's also ultimately how I think you can ultimately reconcile all the various things that are surrounding a particular individual or a particular situation.
We would not have jobs if everybody's answer was going to be yes. So you have to be prepared to provide those no answers, but that equal might not always be fair, and fair might not always be equal. So even if you do have to deliver a negative ruling to somebody, the kid can't play in the game, you can still keep that child engaged through practices. They can still travel with the team. So just trying to deliver that message in a kind way and continue to provide other avenues that the student athlete can continue to be engaged is a way that you can kind of bridge that gap when you do have to deliver a negative